Building Better Aliens. And the description is, all too often the aliens in science fiction are either humans with bad nose jobs or make no sense biologically. This panel will explore the science and logic of making realistic alien species for use in science fiction. Number one, I'm not slamming Star Trek, Babylon 5, any of the media science fiction, because the honest truth is you have to have a human actor portray your alien. And as such, the aliens being humanoid is just simpler. And you also run into the problem of, if you truly make an alien species and it has to move around a human ship, there's going to be difficulties with most of the body design plans that you're going to come to. That doesn't really apply to animation, and it doesn't really apply to some of the new CGI that's coming out. But I understand for budgetary considerations, just generally media sci-fi is going to do that. Literary sci-fi, which is where my main focus is going to be. With literary fiction, you start with a few basic biological parameters. Now, one of them, the first questions you have to ask, what is life? And this is a question that has been bandied about because you can actually take the premise that any sufficiently complex system of semi-permanent and transitory forms that is self-adaptive can be argued to be alive. And if you look at that, the universe itself can be viewed as a living thing. You can look at the more famous version of this, the Gaia Hypothesis, that postulates that the Earth itself is a singular living thing, and we are like cells of its nature. There's good stories to be told, but that's not going to be the focus of my lecture, but it does deserve to be mentioned. When you're doing it for fiction, you have to ask what is required for your story. And we'll get into non-tool using intelligences later, but for the main thrust, it's going to be tool using intelligence. Now, when you're designing a tool using intelligence, we only have one model for life to look at, and that's the life on our own planet. How does the environment shape life? Well, your first question is, what is the base of your environment? Because one of the basic premises of, well, one of the more radical theories in science, but it's a good one, is that all that you really require for life as we would view it is solution chemistry. And that holds out oxygen and carbon life forms like ourselves. It holds out methane as a medium. It holds out hydrogen as a medium. I've even heard tell of models that use arsenic as a base. So you can get life forms, realistic postulates that are in environments that are completely immunicable to each other. If they're intelligent, they are going to have some means of communication, and that could extrapolate into dealing with each other. I do a lot of that in my book, Cloning Freedom, and 120 alien species. Out of that, only 13 of them can share an environment with humanity. So the first step you need to do is conceptualize your environment. You start off by going, what is the base chemical? Is it carbon, hydrogen, methane, arsenic? Then you take the next step. You have to say, what is required for my story? That is very personal. What would they need to function in your environment? Now, if you're going to have an intelligent tool user, you're going to need manipulative digits of some kind. This can be fingers, pincers, tentacles, telekinesis, but some way of doing fine manipulation to the environment, because that's necessary to make tools. Even the most basic stone knife, creating it would be beyond the capacity of most of the life forms on Earth, simply because they don't have that level of fine manipulation. For your intelligent tool user, you have to supply some means to manipulate their environment. But also, while you're doing this, keep an eye on what the precursor species are like. If you look at human beings, you look at Australopithecus, the common ancestor of chimps and Homo sapiens, and you can already see some of the physical traits that have stayed with us throughout the evolution of primates. So you have to look back in time to the baseline species that your sentients are drawn from to get an idea of what they're going to be. And as you're looking back in time, you have to say, what was the environment for them? Was it hot and dry? Was it cold and moist? Was it hot and moist? Because all of these are going to factor in to the body plan you're going to give them. Another thing to consider is that intelligence, as far as we know, will require something analogous to a brain. And brains take a lot of energy. One of the main reasons humans are born as useless and helpless as we are is that we have to be born that early so that the brain, the head, can fit down the birth canal. And everything has funneled itself towards that. So we end up with effectively everybody born who, even if you've gone the full 9 months, is a preemie by the standards of most other animals because the brain was preeminent. How do you accommodate the brain? Look at the body plan and realize that you're going to have dynamics of balance and so forth. Also, another thing to factor in is that you want short nerve runs, short wiring to the brain itself. Because if you look at humans, where do we have our sensory organs? Most of them from the neck up. Reason? Those nerve runs are short, less likely to be severed, more robust, can carry higher levels of data. And this was a natural evolution. And if you look across most animals, you normally have very short nerve runs from their primary sensory systems to their brain. Now, there are several different things you can do with brains, and that is much about the structure. We have, as humans, the mammalian brain structure. And there is some evidence that the avian brain structure may actually, for volume to usefulness, be superior. Ravens have been shown to have roughly the same intelligence as chimpanzees, and their brain is considerably smaller, but it's structured differently. This comes in with some interesting things if you start looking at there's a thought experiment by the paleontologist Dale A. Russell, who postulated that if you were to take Pterodon, one of the smaller raptorial dinosaurs, you could evolve it forward and end up with an intelligent tool-using species. And he did this through a series of logical deductions about what would have happened if it didn't go extinct. Interestingly enough, probably because he just did it on purpose, but it ended up looking like some of the descriptions of space aliens that you get from people who hold to the alien abduction theory, which I will not agree with or disagree with. I'm not going to call people liars. It's a matter of how much evidence and what the evidence leans towards. So, brains take space. You keep that in mind. And that becomes important with the cheat that I'm going to give you a little later on. The other thing is, what are the sensory organs that are suitable to the environment? And this all goes into structure. This all goes into the appearance of your alien. If you look at bats, they use sonar. Why do they have those big pointed ears and ears that are proportionately large to the head? For sonar. Why do cats have mobile ears and can turn them in different ways? It's because they use that to detect prey. and it can allow them to zero in on the location of a rustle far better than we can, who, well, if we're doing it, we're actually doing this, moving the head back and forth to do the same basic thing. One of the few areas that humans excel in sight is sight, and not for night vision, but for color and acuity. That is one of the few areas that we really excel from, and it's by and large because we're evolved from an arboreal species that needed to be able to judge the distance for jumping from one branch to another. Also, what are your species' means of communication going to be? In Cloning Freedom, I have a species called the calentrozoids, and unfortunately, I can't get my screen share to work, or else I'd show you a picture of them. But they look like huge jellyfish. Now, when you deconstruct this a bit, tool using, they have tentacles that dangle down. So, yeah, they could basically grip things and manipulate their environment. So, very useful body plan. For communication, they have a ring of bioluminescent lights that can blink in various colors that goes around the base of their belt. And their language, if to a human watching it, it would translate directly as red, green, blue, yellow, purple, red, orange, blue, purple. Very fast. And there are nuances of shade that humans cannot even detect. It supplies a means for communication, and I drew that from semaphore, which humans have actually used something very similar. It doesn't come naturally to us, but we've used it, and as such, you need to have some means of communication. Now, this can be telepathy. Telepathy is a very interesting one in so much as humans aren't particularly good at it, but it is not completely out there either. There are some models for transmission and reception of the electric field of the human brain that bear some interesting exploration. Again, I'm speaking for fiction, so nobody please beat their drums and start screaming because I'm a fiction writer. Okay, I believe fiction should be based on fact, but I'm willing to take from the fringes as well. And I don't necessarily agree with everything, I just find it useful sometimes. That said, I do think some people have the ability to share thoughts. Right? Brains, space, sensory organs suitable to environment, means of communication. One of the interesting things, and I've touched on it before, is who can share an environment. Which alien species can actually live in each other's environments? And this becomes quite challenging because every environment has a whole host of animals and normal flora. Most of the life is microbial. So you could have a oxygen breathing species that lives in a temperature range similar to us on a planet with a gravity similar to our own, and you still could not go there because a bacteria that's essential for their digestion of food is lethal to Homo sapiens, or vice versa. One of the things, one of the versions of the flu is a part of, I believe it's bovine digestion. Consequently, we'll never be rid of some of these diseases unless we want to wipe out entire other species on our own planet. One of the things that I found is useful, and this is a great cheat, is to take an Earth life form and evolve it. And if you start looking at insects, there are a lot of these that they are prime. They have pincers for manipulative digits. They have eyesight that it's not necessarily the most acute, but it could evolve forward. They just lend themselves. So you can get a lot of intelligent bugs very easily if you start analyzing it. One of my other species in the Freedom Saga, Cloning Freedom, is the spiderzoids, who are small pony-sized spiders. Now, if you're going to do that, if you're going to evolve forward insects, you have to look at the oxygen transfer limit. One of the reasons we don't have giant insects on Earth anymore, like we did in the Devonian period, is the atmosphere has changed. Oxygen quantities are lower, air pressure is lower. Consequently, if you don't have lungs, only so much oxygen can migrate into the body. As a result, it places an extreme size limit on creatures that don't have lungs and an efficient oxygen transfer system. So if you are going to upscale bugs, add lungs. You can add them in inventive ways as long as you are not getting more than a decimeter or so between where the oxygen can be transferred and the organ that needs it. There's lots of different ways you can work on that structure. What I'm saying with part of this is engineering. Look at the body as a mechanical engineering problem. I have to provide these things for my alien to function. How will I supply these things? How would this have happened over the evolution of this being? And another thing to look at when you're dealing with the alien world is the similarities to the other life forms on that world. What are the precursor species? Well, the closest precursor species we have on Earth to ourselves is the chimpanzee. And there are a lot of social factors that are similar between humans and chimpanzees. Chimpanzees are just a little more primal and honest about a lot of things. Look to what those precursor species would do. Look to how they would live and see how that factors into how your dominant, intelligent tool user lives. It also means you can go back to that and have some interesting little dynamics. Now, it's interesting to note that with Homo sapiens, we have either interbred with and absorbed or wiped out all our close relatives. You look at Neanderthals, who many of us have a small quantity of Neanderthal DNA, especially if you're from the British Isles. There were various herbivorous forms of hominid who probably bred in and got wiped out. It's interesting to note that one of chimpanzees' favorite foods is primate. They like to eat each other. They like to eat people. And there's a long history of cannibalism. So even going into the pre-Homo sapien periods, it's very likely that our ancient ancestors were munching down on each other. And we just happen to be descended from the biggest, meanest apes on the block. Tells you a lot about us. How do you combine elements from different animals with a view to function? And yes, Alien is a brilliant example of this. If you look at the Alien movie, they took elements of Earth creatures and just combined the nastiest, most disturbing of the lot into what is an iconic creature from science fiction. And the beauty of it is that anything on that can be found somewhere in the annals of life on Earth. Now, one of the basic premises, bilateral symmetry. 2 arms, 2 legs, 6 arms, even numbers. Now, there's been a couple of science fiction writers who have gotten away from that. If it's done well, no problem. But if it's not done well, it can really come off as contrived. Generally speaking, you're looking to give balance for movement through an environment. Now, this is not as vital in aquatic or aquatic-like environments. You look at life in a gas giant, you probably are going to go more with Earth-ocean life as things that might evolve there, because there are parallels to how the dynamics of the gas and the just how the physics work. Common sense, in designing a good alien, there is a lot of just plain common sense. I'm not going to try to compete with Julie Sunita, who has a doctorate in biology and does brilliant aliens. But I think that just by looking at the general principles of life, I can do a credible job. If it flies, it's going to have light bones. Not necessarily true of a hydrogen breather, maybe not of a methane breather, but of an oxygen breather. If it flies, it's going to have light bones. If it's in a high gravity environment, it might not be able to get off the ground. And you have to consider things like that. What are your capacities? How fast can it fly? How fast can it run? An Olympic sprinter can get up to about 50 kilometers an hour for short distances. Cheetahs can do about 60 kilometers an hour for short distances. Flight takes a lot of energy. If you're going to do that, you need to look at what the creatures are eating. Again, I'm going to come back. What are likely base forms to begin with? Squid, octopi, crabs, apes, monkeys, raccoons, elephants, squirrels. And if you look at all of these, they all have good precursors to tool use. And one of the interesting things is there is part of evolutionary theory that says tool use has a feedback loop with intelligence, because tools make it easier to survive. The better the tool you make, the more likely you are to survive. The better your food supply, the more you're going to be able to get the females. So tool use, manipulative digits, feed back to increase that section of the brain that controls them, which in turn leads to better tools, which in turn feeds back to making the brain better. So there is feedback loops about survivability. And you have to remember, nature is the ultimate pragmatist. Nature is not merciful. Nature is not kind. Nature is a pragmatist. If you deserve to survive, you'll survive, and you'll pass on your genetics. This is a rather risque part of evolutionary theory regarding humans, and this could be adapted to other alien species. I keep coming back to humans because that's the one we have the best model for, but you can draw parallels to it. It is believed, it is known that chimpanzees practice prostitution. High status female chimpanzees will share their favors with low status male chimps who bring them gifts of food. And the high status chimps don't get any say in this. This is the way that the intelligent, good food gatherer, even though he wasn't as muscular and able to fight off the other male chimps to mate, managed to get his genetic with the alpha female, the intelligent, capable, beautiful, etc. chimpanzee. And there is no reason to think that this did not hold consistent throughout most of human evolution. It's just interesting that, again, you have these feedback loops. And when you're designing an alien, you have to look at how would the feedback loops work? How would they have gotten their genetic to carry forward? Oh, yes, another thing about the brain. When you look at the development of intelligence on Earth, cranial folding is a major aspect. Now, they found evidence in the skull of the pterodon dinosaur that they were getting the beginning of cranial folding, which increases the surface area and increases the, I guess you'd call it the density of the biological microchip. And you can chart the folding getting stronger and stronger and stronger as you go along through the evolutionary process. That's another thing to look at, is how is the brain structured? Is it tightly folded? Are there multiple brains? You have that in insects, where you have a primary brain, and to an extent in humans as well, and most mammals, because we have these reflex systems. You tap the knee, the leg kicks. That's not even getting up to your brain. That's just going to your spinal cord and coming back, because there are these auxiliary nodes. You could develop that for use with a alien sentient species. Another one that's interesting, and I'm going to a non-tool user for this, but dolphins seem to have the ultimate split personality, because they have a lobed brain like ours, and one side of that will be asleep while the other side is active and moving the body around, and they seem to trade off. So that is something else that you could draw on to utilize in your alien and have a lot of fun with, because, oh, hi, George. I'm not George. I'm Ralph. Can't you tell the difference? Sorry. Identical twins taken to the umpteenth degree. Yeah. Also, there's things like group minds that you can play with, using bees, ants, things like that as your model, where the intelligence is actually a collective drawn from a variety of individuals. Ask yourself, what about mating forms? How many genders do they have? Many species only have one gender. You look at the earthworm. It is both male and female, and while they can mate with other members of their own species, they can also mate with themselves in a pinch and produce viable offspring. What is the mode of producing the offspring? Mass offspring with little nurture and a few survive? Well, this is typical of things like jellyfish and many marine forms, where they expel huge quantities of fertilized eggs, and they just drift around in the ocean. Most get eaten, and a few manage to survive to perpetuate the species. Turtles are another example where mass layings, practically no nurture. Alligators do some nurture in so much as they'll carry their newly hatched offspring from the nest to a likely water source, release them, but the next day they're as likely to eat their offspring as they are to nurture it. The other model is the human model: few offspring, highly nurtured. And by few, I mean cats, relatively few offspring, and they can have 6 to a litter, but they are definitely high on the nurture end of things. And they care for the offspring until they are ready to care for themselves. There's a thing called the Nipple rule for mammals, and this is so much common sense that I think it's probably can be taken as a likely universal. The average number of offspring in any given birthing for a mammal will be half the number of nipples that the mother has in a healthy individual of the species. This is basically a safety factor, so if some of them clap out, you can still feed the kids. It doesn't always hold true. You do get exceptions, like humans having twins or particularly large litters, but on average, it's something to take into account. Another means of feeding the young that's quite common: regurgitation. If you have a nurturer, it may well pre-digest the food and regurgitate for the young to eat. Think of baby birds. One would move on from mating form. Talk about sexuality. In a more realistic universe, Kirk would not have been a particularly happy camper, because the majority of creatures are going to have varying sexualities. And if you think about this, is recreational as opposed to reproductive, because the idea of two creatures that have no common precursor species being able to mate and produce offspring falls into the realm of the ludicrous. When you look at chimpanzees, who are 98% of the same genetic that we are, we cannot mate successfully with them. They cannot even carry, and this was a rather dodgy experiment that was done years and years ago, but they implanted human zygotes into chimpanzees, and they would always abort prior to the first trimester. It's ludicrous to think that you're going to mate and successfully breed with creatures evolved on another planet. This is, you never say never. I mean, in the vastness of time, in the vastness of space, anything can happen, but it's just a matter of how low a probability. Consequently, that leaves with recreational. Number one, does the species even have recreational sexuality? Most species don't. If it does, it's probably going to be on a human model where it helped to entice one of the mating pair to stay and help raise the offspring of the union, which is one of the practical reasons that we have recreational sexuality. It's also going to be a question of how is it done with the calentrozoids. They live on gas giants and they mate in the stagnant core of huge typhoon-like, huge typhoon-like weather systems. And they do it en masse because one-on-one is absolutely useless from a reproductive sense for them, because they have to get a certain concentration of eggs and sperm into that stagnant air mass for anything to happen. Obviously not fodder for human romance. So you're looking at having to have that aspect, and that aspect is going to do things like, okay, yeah, pair bonding will happen, or group bonding. There's postulates for 3 gender species, where you have the male, female, and the neuter carries the children of the male and female, because both male and female were necessary in that environment to obtain enough nutrition. And again, this factors back into environment, where the harsher the environment, the more you're going to get these multiple groups supplying for the young. Okay, now I'm going to do the shout out to intelligent non-tool users, because I like dolphins, I like whales, I like orcas, I like all of these. Rob Sawyer did an interesting thing with using dolphins for pilots in ships, because humans created the interface, and the dolphins, because they were used to living in an environment that had up and down as perfectly viable directions, were just the best aces in the world, best aces in the universe. They could fly rings around other species, but the humans had to build the interface. When it comes to it, they are really good for philosophical stuff, and David Brin had the dolphins that he evolved and put in exoframes, and in his uplift series. Really a good sort of thing that if you want to play with it, you can play with it, but the same basic rules apply, and they just need the helping hand of somebody giving them some means of effectively manipulating their environment. And one of the things that you can do with manipulating the environment that I don't think I've mentioned yet is trunks. You look at elephants. Elephants are fairly good at manipulating their environment. Some people have written double trunks because it is nice to be able to grapple and move things. One of the big reasons parents don't do as much manipulation as they do is they have to stand on their feet at the same time they use them. So they're basically one-handed at best, and it's not particularly well situated for watching what they do. They sacrificed a lot to get airborne. Well, the other thing that I've done with my Freedom Saga, which Cloning Freedom is the first book of, and book 2 is coming out in December, which is Freedom's Law. As I mentioned earlier, I have 120 species in the Interstellar Republic. One of the things that I found fascinating is trying to find common ground between them, because the things that are going to interest, let's say, a calentrozoid, are going to be very different from the things that interest a human being. For one of the things, calentrozoids have no concept of stealing food, because the plankton of the air is the plankton of the air. For man or machine, for being or machine, you feed when you need to. And this is because they're drift feeders. And this factored out into their culture due to the fact that they're drifting through, and if they happen to see a plankton bloom, they suck it in, and that's lunch. They cannot conscience the human thing of actually having to pay for food because their environment supplied that. They do have a concept of theft for a thing of matter, because they would build things and then you could take a thing of matter from somebody without giving them recompense. So again, their biology dictated that. Another aspect of their biology that dictated by their biology was that they have no concept of trespass, because the winds blow where they will, and one cannot not always brace against them. So you can imagine their environment as, yeah, they're drift feeders. They drift along and they have some propulsion, but it would be like us trying to walk against a full-blown tornado. They very often find themselves in the position of being sucked up, carried along, and just dropped anywhere. And you just sort of cross your tentacles that you're not going to run into anything solid while you're doing it. Fortunately, being a gas giant, if you're not close to the very core of it, there aren't a great deal of solid things. So this has worked for them. With the crabzoids, I do the thing of them. They are hive mind, and their individualities keep contacting back to the core. They're more or less just wiped anytime they contact back to the core. Their memories of the separate component become part of this greater whole, and then they're sent out with a mission, whatever it be. Their reproductive system is very similar to bees, where a new central nexus will be created and the hive splits. And where there was one, there are two. Each one has half the information, half the knowledge, half the gatherer components of the original. And they just fight it out in some way as to who's going to have to get out of Dodge and find a new place to live. So these are the kind of things that as a fiction writer you can have a lot of fun with just by looking at the life around you. There was a short story that I wrote, which effectively is an insectoid based on the praying mantis, and he's trying to stay away from the enemy because the enemy is going to eat him. And then it turns out that the enemy is the female of the species, and like the praying mantis, once they mate, they eat their partner. It's looking at how these things that are carried over from the early stages of development can affect the sentient being. And there are many of these things with humanity. The way that we vie for mates, even in the modern era, you go to any given high school, you're going to see threat displays that are akin to what chimpanzees. It's no longer really functional for us now, but it's there because it's hardwired in from all this past evolution, which is part of why it is so important to have a sense of where your intelligent tool user came from. Thank you for listening, and please check out my works at the site shown on the screen, www.stephenperl.com. That's www.stephenperl.com. I am also on Amazon and have the blog Stephen's Musings. Have a nice day.